Ladies and gentlemen, we're in for a treat for today. We have another installment of the Meet the Chiefs series. Today, we're very fortunate to have Chief Master Sergeant retired Joe Tersero join us. Chief Tersro retired out of the Washington, D.C. United States Air Force Band. He is a bassoonist by trade and kept playing bassoon throughout his career. He's going to tell us a little bit about his background and his Air Force career. So take things away, Chief Tersero.
All right. So I first want to congratulate you on this series because it's absolutely marvelous. I've been watching the other videos of Chief Ledoux, Chief Bob Vasquez, and Martha Garcia, and those are some pretty amazing videos, and they're all good friends of mine. And I also like hearing about the enlisted musicians because those are the people that are really important that make things happen for the Air Force. The Chiefs, our job is to help them fly, help them get up there and do their job and perform at their very best. So my early influences in music, I think we were talking about your interest in knowing about that. Before I actually talk about that, I'd like to talk about the my prevailing mantra as a chief, and that is I always wanted to honor my mentors. At this point in my career, I look back and I think about all the great mentors I've had that have made me who I am. And I think one of the persons who did the most to have that idea put out there was Larry Lang. He had made that the theme of the 2012 Midwest Convention for the Air Force Band. So that's what I'm getting ready to do, is to honor my mentors by remembering them. Of course, my earliest influence was my dad and my grandfather. They both had extremely incredible work ethics. Anybody that you talk to both say hardest working men they've known, and highly dedicated. So that's where I learned that, is that work ethic. My dad started me on guitar, and then he added piano. And my sister started off on clarinet. She decided she didn't want to play it anymore. So when I was in the 6th grade, I took her clarinet and went from there. So I'm in the elementary school, and my band director was an oboe player by the name of Steve Killo. My most fond memory of Steve Killo was us clarinet kids were talking, and he told us to be quiet, please be quiet, and of course we didn't. And of course he's talking to the brass section, demonstrating the trombone. So we kept talking, and then all of a sudden let out one of the loudest trombone blasts that we've ever heard. And a couple of the kids actually fell over in the chairs. So that was my trombone first memory, I think. So have you ever blasted somebody off the stage?
I try. Well, we're French horn, so I'm already at a disadvantage. I face backwards, and somebody told a joke once that it's French. It's a French horn because the French fire backwards.
Okay, and then I went to junior high, and junior high is where I switched from clarinet to bassoon. My band directors were Ken Williams, Annette Booth, and they were major influences, especially Ken Williams, because he's the one who asked the class, who wants to play the bassoon? And that's, band directors are always looking for oboe players and bassoon players. So we all looked at him and we said, but what? And then he took it out, and it was just the most funniest looking thing we've ever seen. And there was all kinds of jokes going on, and he got it all together. And then he played the Budweiser March, which was one of my favorite commercials at the time with the Clydesdales. So I rose my hand like that, and I thought I had gotten it down in time, but I didn't. He said, you're perfect. And I was a pretty good clarinet player, so I was always having competitions with the girl clarinet player. that was another reason why I kind of liked the idea of switching to bassoon, because all the clarinet players were girls.
Yeah.
And I wanted a manly instrument. Turns out that as I went through my education, most of the girls were bassoon players. So it was, especially in the high schools. And the one thing that I did when I was in junior high is I practiced a lot. And we had a teacher from the high school that would come down from time to time to help out. And he noticed my practice reports, and he said, wow, this guy, he says he practices 3 hours a day. So he called me in, and he said, look, I see that you're taking this instrument very seriously. I'd like to offer you free lessons. I don't know much about the bassoon because I'm a cornet player, but I can tell you about rhythm and tone and intonation, so I can really help you develop if you want to do that. And about that time, my dad passed away. So I was highly appreciative that he offered that. It was like a mentor right there at the right time. So I would go, he would pick me up in his truck every Saturday. We would go to the high school, and he would teach me. He was pretty significant because he gave me this book called Teacher's Guide to the Bassoon by Homer Pence, which had all the more advanced concepts of playing bassoon and an incredible fingering chart. So I memorized all those fingerings within a week. So the next lesson he came in, and he was just astounded that I had already done that. And like I said, 3 hours a day. And that's very unusual for a 7th grader. But I had a lot of making up to do as far as practicing. And as I progressed, when I was in the 9th grade, I was one of 2 bassoonists to make the Texas All-State Band as a freshman. That was the first time that happened. He got me in touch with the high school band director, and he would start taking me up to Baylor University for clinics. And that's when I would learn a lot, because I would listen to not just the person doing the clinic, but also the other students. So I was more learning by watching what other people did, observing, and then
what were
the high school band director.
Some of your early influences with the military bands?
That was the Marine Band, of course, came through, the band at Lackland, and of course the 2nd AD band on Fort Hood, Texas. Those were all pretty darn good bands. Of course, the Marine Band was almost immediately one of those bands that I wanted to go into. And then we had a community band called the Heights Concert Band that was made up of band directors. So it was pretty nice to be able to play with people that advanced. They had already finished college and been out teaching for a while. Carlton Morris was the conductor of that band, and they had an incredible euphonium player, Ken Wood. And my friend and I, Frank Albright, he was an oboe player. Actually, Frank was a woodwind specialist. He could play every single woodwind instrument equally as well. He could even play bassoon, but I think he just let me be the bassoon player. And of course, during one of the events when we were going up to Baylor University, my high school band director looked over at me. This was my 3rd year in high school, and he said, I'll make a deal with you. If you make the Texas All-State Band 4 years in a row, I'll help you buy your first Heckel bassoon. I said, okay. That put the pressure on, because it's not easy making the Texas All-State Band and knowing that you're going to make it 4 years in a row. Mm-hmm. Because the competition was unbelievable back then. They only had 2 bands and 2 orchestras. Then I made my transition to college. And my teachers were, go ahead.
Did you get that bassoon?
Not yet. in fact, I didn't even order it yet. It was just a deal that he made.
Yeah.
So I went to Texas Tech University in Lubbock. Richard Meek was my bassoon teacher, and that orchestra was absolutely incredible. Some of the absolute finest players in Texas. And as a freshman, I went in and I was the principal bassoonist. That's kind of rare to happen, to come in and just kind of like knock everybody else out of that position. But, you know, I think once the players realized that I earned it, it worked out great. Then I heard about a bassoon teacher at Baylor University in Waco, Texas, Dr. Danny Phipps. He was a Curtis grad and had quite the reputation, and built a really big studio for a Texas school. I had far more bassoon Texas Tech, and that's what I wanted. I wanted more competition. I didn't want to be at the top of the heap. I wanted to be kind of like in the middle, so I can just learn from the other great players. One of the great players that I learned from was actually during the summer camp, David McGill, principal bassoonist of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. Well, he just retired from that position. But we were walking and talking about the bassoon and how we got our start and who our teachers were. Of course, I had no real teacher other than a trumpet player, a cornet player. And he looked over at me, and just to give you an idea about David was Mensa. He had an IQ just off the charts, and his bassoon playing was equal to that. But he looked over at me and he said, "You know what? You're a freak." And I'm like, but then he said, "No, I mean it in the tradition of the true meaning of the word as a noun, that it's totally amazing that you taught yourself how to double tongue, triple tongue, and all the advanced techniques that bassoonists who've been playing for quite a few number of years and have great teachers are able to master. But you did it all on your own." And so that was actually a compliment. And I would actually meet David again years later, but not, it was on the CD that I did at Langley called The Grand Serenade for an Awful Lot of Winds, Peter Shickley. And that CD actually won a Grammy Award.
Oh, wow.
So that was quite an accomplishment. After Baylor, Danny Phipps decided to go into the Air Force. And that was a good move because it made me decide I need to go somewhere else. And Danny helped me get into the Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana. There's where I studied with Sid Rosenberg and met a lot of absolutely stunning performers, Joshua Bell being one of them. I don't know if you know Joshua Bell, but I met him when he was just 15, and I was a sophomore at Indiana University, and I used to go to his concerts. He would give solo performances and ensemble works, and every time it would just take my breath away. As a 16-year-old, I mean, he was a protege.
There was something unique about him that you told me before. Share that with the audience. I think it was his key to success was that he was an avid something or other.
Yes, he was an avid video player, video games. So there was arcades where you go in and they have all these arcade machines, and his initials were top rated on all machines, almost routinely. And I would go in there a few times and I would watch him play just to see how he operated. And there was one game that he didn't have the top score on, and that was the game Galaga. And there's a trick to that that I found out from a friend of mine, Frank Albright from high school, that helps you play unlimited games. You just you don't have all the bombs dropping down on you. So there's a trick to making that happen, and I knew that trick. So you could always tell that he would go in there from time to time and try to up my score, but he never did.
Yeah.
So that was about the time when I got my notice about my bassoon being ready. And that that's when, of course, I had called my high school band director, and I said, were you serious about helping me buy my bassoon? And he said, yes, I was. He said, how much do you need? And I said, $3,000. And of course, that was only the down payment. So he gave me the check for $3,000. Wow. And I do have to tell you that when I went into the Air Force, I didn't have to, because he made that very clear. This is a gift for making the All-State Band 4 years in a row. That's your reward from me and my wife Linda. And I said, no, I'm going to pay this money back. So my first few paychecks from the Air Force went to my band director, just to pay him back, because I highly appreciated the offer. But you know, high school band directors, I don't know that they're all that well compensated.
Yeah,
but $3,000 is a lot of money. Then before I leave Indiana University, I have to say, when I decided to go into the Air Force to help to build up the remaining amount of money due, I left Indiana. My teacher really wanted to keep me, so he was trying all kinds of things to make that happen. But I think I was just ready for a change. But when I didn't take his offer, he said he told one of my best friends there that it was such a shame because he thought it was a waste of talent, me going into a military band. I don't know what military bands he heard, but obviously he didn't hear the ones that I was going into. Because, you know, I look back and I think about that. Did I make the right decision? And I can tell you, yes, absolutely. Looking back, having the career that I did and doing as many things as I did, a person going into a symphony orchestra doesn't get that kind of exposure, worldwide exposure. And just working with different people, different career fields, and that's just what makes life interesting. So after that, you know, I finished my degree at Shenandoah Conservatory of Music in Winchester, Virginia, my performance degree. That's kind of unusual because I went from school to school to school, which means I have at least 3 or 4 different perspectives on how music theory works and how music history works, how to interpret grout, and all those books that we studied in college. And of course, I also had went to Catholic University to work on a master's in library science and musicology. I didn't finish because my job in the Air Force got to be really, really busy. So I was halfway done. So, of course, I leave Indiana. I go down to Lackland to audition. And at the Air Force Band of the West, there's a clarinet player there by the name of Peter Wadey. And that audition went extremely well, and he just immediately accepted me. I mean, he just said, "Hey, you don't need to play for anyone else. You're accepted." I think he had talked to the bassoonist. The bassoonist was walking by and said, just gave the thumbs up. I think the bassoonist's name is Lance Cameron, or Cameron Lance. So that was kind of nice, just winning my very first gig audition, I guess you would say.
So now you're back in Texas. Did you get a chance to now perform as an Air Force musician for your band director?
Not yet, but eventually I would.
Yeah.
The next thing up was, of course, basic training.
Yeah.
And of course, I had quite an interesting experience in basic training, an amazing experience of going down to the snack bar at one of the breaks and then seeing this girl who kept looking at me, blonde hair, blue eyes, and she came over and started talking to me, and I noticed that her name was Crisp on her name tag. So I said, don't tell me. I said, you're from North Carolina. And I said, I bet I know your relatives. So I started naming people. And then I said, I bet you're from Murphy, North Carolina, or the city around there. And she just got really spooked. So I had to tell her, yeah, we're cousins. So that was quite an experience. She had actually wrote me a note, and I still have that note. So that was a pretty interesting experience. And of course, I did the time in the Drum and Bugle Corps, which was absolutely magnificent. I enjoyed that thoroughly. Even as a bassoonist, when I was in high school, I marched with the bass drum. I didn't do any marching in college. I was only in orchestras, which was the interesting thing about Indiana University. They had 6 symphony orchestras when I was there, and about 2 or 3 chamber orchestras. And if you were a performance major, you did double and triple duty with those orchestras. So I went through a tremendous amount of repertoire in a very short amount of time. And of course, that served me well, because when I went to Langley Air Force Base, the conductor, the first conductor was Richard Shelton. He was much more of a show band kind of person. And then Mark Peterson, he kind of continued in that vein, but with a little bit more concert works. But I was kind of miserable, just working on basic band pieces, and not really the meaty repertoire, the great transcriptions. And then Lowell Graham came to town. I don't know if you're familiar with Lowell Graham, but Dr. Lowell Graham, he immediately started transforming the band into a real concert band that had the chops to do both classical, any type of music. Of course, there was a mass exodus of players who were of that old ilk of just wanting to do show tunes. They didn't want to have to spend a lot of time practicing. Especially classical music. I'm talking about things like La Mer or Daphnis et Chloe. That was not their cup of tea. So they left, and of course, Colonel Graham got some really tremendous players in. And that's kind of when I made my decision to stay, was because of the music that he programmed. It challenged me. First up was The Rite of Spring.
I remember you telling me a little bit about, and this may be a good tip for people, is that, you know, sometimes it's ebb and flow sometimes, and for a while it wasn't music that was your cup of tea, but you showed up early in the morning and would play along with orchestral pieces to keep your appetite whet. And so maybe that's a little bit of a resiliency tip for some of us. You know, I'm a French horn player, and, you know, I'm not always going to be playing music that is, you know, my cup of tea as a French horn player, but I have to find, you know, outlets to keep that appetite and those skill sets up. And
yep, and probably one of my favorite ensembles there was the Wind Quintet, because we went through a ton of material. I really liked it because we would play, and I called it the Hee-Haw Quintet. Because we would play a piece, and then Wayne Hedrick would tell a few jokes. The band. It was just one of the most enjoyable groups to play with. And it was quite literally that friendly hee-haw kind of atmosphere. I don't know if you're familiar with that show. It's a country and western show. Yeah. But we would play things like On the Road Again. I did an arrangement of that. And, we went outside the box. Tom Watts, I don't know if you've ever played his transcriptions, his quintet transcriptions. I think most bands should have them. I'd be surprised if somewhere in your library they don't exist. If they don't exist, let me know. I'll get them to you.
Tell me a little bit about, that's maybe a good point to speak of, is you said you arranged some stuff, and was that something you had come in with, or is that a skill set you developed while you were in the Air Force?
That, for me, was a skill set that I learned when I got into the Air Force. All the techniques of how to do it. And we just got to do it. And of course, finale and Sibelius didn't exist, or at least, no, they didn't exist at that time. So it's by hand. But again, it was something that you could learn and you can do, and you can just start cranking out charts. And of course, that Langley band, several of the reasons why I decided to make the Air Force a career was that bassoonists back then, bassoonists and oboists, were in a shred by themselves. So we only competed against each other. So I only competed against other bassoonists, and usually there's only one or two or three at the max competing. So bassoonists and oboists always got promoted far faster than anyone else. And I think they added horn to that mix as well. Of course, that Paradise, I think too many people complained that all the chiefs in the career field were oboists and bassoonists. And like I said, I think back to Tom Lott's absolutely incredible oboe player. And the recordings that Lowell Graham did. It was just recording after recording after recording. And it was really nice the way he paced it. He is one of the most easy persons to record with because he keeps the pressure very low. Favorite phrase of his was tape is cheap. So you just go back and do it again, and usually people got it right. So the recordings were absolutely amazing. And then, of course, the great musicians from that Langley band. A lot of them, including myself, went on to become chiefs because of the work ethic that Lowell Graham instilled in us.
I think you had mentioned to me previously, for example, that double rehearsals was not uncommon.
Yes. Well, he chose the music. He never liked to do just one program.
Yeah.
He liked to do two or three.
Yeah.
So it was a lot more music and a lot more challenging. And I enjoyed that. The people who were in that band, all the old timers had left. So he had all people who pretty much knew him. They knew what he wanted. They knew how he wanted to do it. And they knew the work that it was going to take to get there. So if you listen to the very first few recordings, you can say, you can hear a steady progression on how great the band was becoming, because he really did develop it in a very systematic way, tackling rhythmic issues like with El Salon Mexico, and of course then adding the Rite of Spring pieces other than the Strauss pieces. So just to name a few of the chiefs that came out of that band, Peter Aiello, Craig Ledoux, I think he was a CEM at the Right Path there, if I'm not mistaken. Eric Strohecker, Robin Forster Meadows, Barbara Taylor. And there was one individual player named Kathleen Cook. She was a cornet player, and she went on to become the director of public affairs as a brigadier general. So very highly influential person. But she always looked back at her Langley days with fondness. And she was an inspiration to me and many others. Her husband, Tom Cook, was an absolutely phenomenal performer. He could knock people's socks off. He could sing Lou Rawls better than Lou Rawls. He could really milk the crowd, excited, and he was someone who connected on a personal level. Just one of the most stunning performers I've ever seen. And it's kind of funny because early on when I first got there, and I was like kind of miserable. I think about after a few months, people would go up to him and say, well, he pulled me to the side one day and he said, look, I need to tell you this, just so you know. People think you're stuck up. And he said, but I tell him, no way, man. He's totally cool. You just need to go and talk to the guy. So, I highly appreciate him speaking on my behalf and making people understand that as musicians, you are dependent on the other performer. If the other performer is not up to standard, is not being encouraged, then it'll never get better, and you'll never excel because you're dependent on them. And so that band worked hard, and we practiced hard. While I was at Langley, one of the things that I really remember was going TDY to the Air Force Band. That was a routine 2 to 3 times a year to do recordings and major events and an occasional tour. We did a tour of all the major halls on the East Coast, and that was really enjoyable. And then, of course, going to the Nco Academy and the Senior Nco Academy, that would come later when I was at the DC band. So I had orders to Scott from Langley. Colonel Bankhead called down. He said, "Can we use Joe for a recording session in December?" My orders were for me to report in December to Scott, and so I got a waiver from the orders, or an extension, and went to the DC band, did a recording. There was a professional jealousy between Graham and Bankhead. They were always trying to outdo one another as far as, the recordings that they would put out. And so there was a point in time where Graham refused to let me go to a TDY to the DC band. That was kind of close to that time. So we were kind of surprised that he said yes. So when I went up there, did the recording session, and it was the Many Moods of Christmas, I believe. It was one of the first LPs that they later converted to CD. And that's when they announced the library opening. And so I went in and I told Colonel Bankhead that I like that position. And he said, "It's yours," because he saw that as a way of getting his third bassoon and contra, and just having me there. He already knew I could do the job. Then
and that wasn't something that you told me earlier, you hadn't necessarily done library type duties. So you, I think, alluded to that with many things that you've taken on in your life. Engage yourself extensively on all the things you need to know to be successful.
Right. My first approach when I get a new tasking is to go and to do a deep dive. So I went to all the other service bands, especially the Marine band. At the time they had 7 full-time librarians. So I learned a lot from those guys, and some of the most friendliest people I've ever met for all the bands. And I'm one of the very few people that can probably name the librarian accession from the 4 service bands, from the time I got to the DC band from 1980, 84, 89. So I had, my orders were changed. I went back down to Langley and went in, talked to Colonel Graham. I told him that he asked me how the recording session went. I said, "Oh, it was great. It's fantastic." Then he said, but I need to tell you that I'm not going to Scott."
Yeah.
He said, "Really?" And I said, "Oh yeah, I'm going to the DC band. My orders were changed for me to go to the DC band." And you could just see the redness coming up from his neck up to the top of his head, because he had been hoodwinked, I guess you would say, by James Bankhead. Yeah. So I noticed that, but I never approached him about that. Bankhead, I did tell the story to, and quite amusing. And that, the conductors, they really do have their egos, and most of them deservedly so. The Air Force has some really great conductors, and of course, I have my favorites. Lowell Graham is certainly high up on that list. Since I asked to come in as the librarian, there was a big to-do about who my under what shop am I going to fall under for supervision. The concert band felt like they owned me because I was a bassoonist and a contrabassoonist, and that's where they felt the greatest need was. And of course, they had more chiefs. And then music production said, no, he took a librarian audition. And so it ended up, Mike Bankhead told Mike Wheeler, my first supervisor, Chief Mike Wheeler, to just let me decide. So that was the choice that was offered to me, is which shop do you want to fall under for your supervision? And I had to think about that one. But I chose the music production, and I've been happy with that decision ever since. Because all my supervisors from the time I got there were chiefs. So it started off with Mike Wheeler, then it went to Mike Davis, Bob Dyer, and Gene Gardner. And that's highly unusual for a tech sergeant to have a chief as his supervisor for all those years, as I've made it up through the ranks. But I learned a lot from those chiefs. If you think about the combined years of experience in that group of people, and leadership and how to go on with people. One of the most valuable lessons I learned from my first supervisor, Mike Wheeler, was when you have a great employee or you see somebody who knows what they're doing and they're dedicated, just get out of their way and support them and give them whatever support they need. And that's what all my supervisors did, and my commanders as well. One of the interesting things about being in the DC band is being able to freelance. Of course, that is non-existent right now with the COVID-19. And I would say most of the performers here have their off-duty employment form, which enabled me to play in the National Philharmonic, which is a great symphony orchestra that operates out of the Strathmore Music Hall, the Annapolis Chorale and Chamber Orchestra, the Alexandria Symphony Orchestra, the Baltimore Opera Orchestra, the Fairfax Symphony, and the Richmond Symphony. So I gigged with all those amazing orchestras throughout my Air Force career. And also was able to teach part-time at Catholic University on the faculty there, and also I was on the staff at George Mason. So there's just tons of opportunities for you to grow and to learn and to hone your craft.
What would you say were some of the biggest challenges at the start, and maybe continuing on, taking on that role of being a librarian for the DC?
Well, I kind of realized early on that I needed to make the job easier and to avoid repetitive tasks. So if you did something once, you wouldn't have to do it again. So along about that time, there is a DoD program called Legacy. And it was meant for preserving our national heritage, whether it's documents, it's photographs, or whatever. So I put in a request for an amazing digital copier. It cost about $300,000. Didn't think I would get it, but that was one of the lessons I learned from Mike Bankhead is when you want something, go for the absolute best. So, I asked for publishers, I said, from Ludwig and from J.W. Pepper, what machine do you use? And they have these machines that they scan it in once, and then it puts it in booklet form, and then it's ready to go whenever someone else requests that piece. It's a print-on-demand system. So that's the system I got. So it's funny because the Marine Band librarians would come over and they would refer to it as the aircraft carrier of copiers. And it's funny how the Air Force works, that we seem to be able to get things that the other bands can't get. The Marine Band, they're subject to the Navy, and the Navy doesn't like to spend a lot of money on things. They'd rather put their money on ships. So we benefited greatly from that.
Tell us a little bit about it. You are co-author of a fantastic resource for all of us bandsmen to read, and any of the general public, in fact. And you're kind enough, I think I'll maybe have a copy in the mail. History of the Air Force Bands.
So Larry Lang, who I think is one of the finest conductors and gentlemen that I've ever met, came to town, and it's funny because he came to town right during sequestration. So he did something very unique. He tapped into the mindset of the band people. What can we do? How can we make this better? And of course, they came up with the flash mobs. So he solicited ideas from the band, and that was pretty much what he did throughout his career. And he knew that the 75th anniversary of the band was coming up, so he wanted to redo the history that was on the walls that Denny Leyendecker had started. So he upped that to museum quality. If you go to any really fancy museum, that's kind of what it looks like. Very nice frames, Adler display cases, mannequins, uniforms on mannequins. So the band had lots of historical uniforms, and some of them donated and some of them that the band had. So that was his initiative. And of course, the 75th anniversary, but he wanted to have something that he could give the alumni when they came in. So he asked me and Harry Gleason, who was probably the foremost historian the band has ever had. And I need to talk a little bit about him before I go on, because Harry was the one who really took the history of the band seriously. He would go and do interviews with all the really old timers from World War II. A lot of people didn't know that the Air Force Band deployed to Europe during World War II. So they were like circling England, and went to France, and that's when the war is still going on. The Army Band had also sent theirs. In fact, they went for 2 years. The Air Force was only there for about six months. They were only supposed to stay 3 months, but they ended up them staying an additional 3 months. And that was one of those initiatives where Howard had talked to people for Britain and arranged for a mutual exchange tour. So the Royal Air Force Band came to the United States and circled the entire United States. The Air Force Band, the Army Air Forces Band, went to England and circled that entire island probably several times. But it was one of the most successful deployments that the band has ever had. And there were times where, you know, they had like German Luftwaffe airplanes coming in and strafing that band when they were performing. That's one of the things that's mentioned in the book. So, pretty amazing.
Before I forget, you mentioned deployments. So you had a very unique deployment in your career.
I did. That was 2008. It was a time period where it was pretty dangerous, and we were still sending the bands out in these up-armored Humvees. It was the Army that got us around, and they were having us lock and load our weapons inside that Humvee several times because it was like a really dangerous area. And you're not asked to do that because they'd be afraid of somebody accidentally shooting. But when they ask you to do that, it's very serious. They think that there's trouble ahead. And sure enough, I think on one of the missions that we went on, there was an explosion that went on ahead of us. It was about a mile and a half ahead. So, of course, they immediately turned and went the other way, but it was pretty experience. We got to the hospital at Bagram Air Base, which is the one hospital that has given out more Purple Hearts than any other hospital, because that's where they treat the wounded for the first initial triage at the hospital. And then, so we're there. They had just finished evacuating a fairly large contingent of patients to Ramstein or wherever they sent them. But there were still a few people left. There was 2 Army personnel who had been involved in a Humvee rollover. And then there was 2 Afghan girls. One that was had swallowed a battery. She was up and walking around smiling, but you could tell they had to do something with her throat because it corroded in the throat. And then there was a girl who got injured when she stepped on a landmine. She was pretty despondent. She had body casts. You could still see the blood oozing out of certain parts of the bandages. but they were playing an acoustic show in the hospital there. So this little girl, she hears this incredible sound coming from Max Impact. They were doing Life is a Highway from Cars. She gets up and she asks the nurse to help her get down from the bed, and then she goes out and she starts smiling, and the nurses there were absolutely crying. They couldn't believe that, you know, she had being despondent for so long, but she had the interest to get up after hearing the music. I mean, it really moved her. And she came out and she smiled, and the nurses are just crying and hugging each other and talking to her and encouraging her. And in the back, you can see the parents, and they're absolutely smiling. So that's the amazing thing about the hospitals, the military hospitals for the military, the U.S. military, is that they'll treat the locals. Now, one of the nurses had told me that it's typical that children and adults get blown up in landmines in that area. Apparently, when the Russians left, they had peppered the rich farming area with landmines. So it wasn't unusual to have people like that coming in to be treated.
Yeah, it's an incredible story about the real power that music can bring. Like you said, she had been in such hard spirits, and you know, reasonably, given what she had gone through, and for them to be able to bring some joy, you know, in such a hard time, I think really speaks to the soft power that we can bring, especially on you know, downrange in those deployment settings. And like you said, even more so in a time like that, when it was even more dangerous than, you know, it is maybe currently or historically.
And music is one of the best music therapies in the world. I'm reminded of a portrait that the Air Force Band has hanging in the hangar there. It's an Army Air Forces pilot from World War II. That portrait was hanging up. It was actually originally at the Pentagon, but protesters came through and said that portrait promotes war. You guys need to take that. They eventually got so much talk about it that they actually did take it down. But it came to the Air Force Band because it had a national anthem theme, Over the Ramparts We Watch. So it's a pilot holding a bomb and in a bomber jacket. When I first got when the portrait first got there, I was always wondering, who is that person? So we would ask the Air Force art people if they knew who it was, and they said no, I had no idea. We know who the artist is. So I contacted people who knew the artist, and they didn't have any information on who that pilot was. Lo and behold, with the internet, the pilot's daughter reaches out to the Pentagon and says, has any of you ever seen this portrait? It's of my dad. And she had seen it in Liberty magazine. Somebody said that they thought they had remembered seeing it at the Air Force Band. So they got in contact with us, and then they had her flying out from, I think it was North Dakota or somewhere. And then we contacted the artist's relatives because we were able to figure out who it was once we had a name. So interacting with the families, we found out all kinds of information on him. He was suffering from PTSD, and that's why he was here in Washington, D.C., and why he posed for that portrait. And it's an incredible painting. And it's still at the Air Force Band.
I remember you also telling me, so maybe kind of following those lines of you were part of overhauling the actual building, the Air Force building, to show more artifacts and you know, posters and whatnot of the history of the Air Force Band. So.
Colonel Landecker had started that initiative, but it was Larry Lang who really put the refinement on it. And he had my wife and I take that lead on that. My wife is still in the band. Jennifer Moore, she's a flutist in the band. She just got a 1-year extension, so she'll be in the band until 2022. And that's all because of the session rate and how they can audition people and get them in the band. Basic training right now is at half bed capacity, with the band not being high on the priority list. So she was able to request an extension in the best interest of the Air Force. And she just recently got that. And that's rarely given out, but I think there's good reason to be giving it out right now. So if there are any bandsmen out there who are reaching their high year tenure and they know that they're going to be in a hard instrument to replace, they might want to request an extension.
Well, now it says, as we kind of come towards the end of the interview, which I wish we had even more time, but I'd love you to talk about what you think some of the most valuable takeaways from your Air Force career have spilled over into, because you were by no means retired. You retired from active duty, but you're still heavily involved. And so tell us a little bit about that transition and what you feel like the tools you acquired during your time in have really helped you continue.
Of course, there's that whole library influence, working with the Marine Band, library staff. Of course, they also have quite a number of artifacts. When I got out of the Air Force, one of the things that they did was they had a lot of items that they needed to get assessed into the museum at the National Museum of the Marine Corps at Quantico, Virginia. So they hired me because they had a hard time getting that done, even with, by now, 6 librarians. So they were really happy to hire me to get that done. I did. Basically, that's a job where you take items that were donated. Think about all the things that they had donated from John Philip Sousa and the great conductors, if you think of John Bourgeois. They all donated items to the Marine Band. And they want to preserve those things. Sometimes things that they would get from countries that they would tour to, or places that they would go, or things that just were really significant. So you can go there, you see just about all kinds of instruments from the years that goes back as far as their beginning, really. I mean, their uniform artifacts. It's pretty impressive to see all those uniforms being displayed at one time. They don't do it all that often, but when it's a significant event, they'll put them all out there on mannequins, and it's really impressive to see. I did need to circle back a little bit on one of the important influences from the Air Force Band, and that is the guest artist series. It was not uncommon to see artists just coming in, and they got to be so routine that you just it didn't really phase you like it normally would. And I'm thinking about people like Marie Osmond, Charlie Pride, Helen Reddy, Roy Clark, 3 Mo tenors, Morgan Freeman, and Lou Gossett Jr., actors. It was just totally amazing. Helen Reddy was one of my favorites. And, you know, when I was growing up watching country western music on TV with my dad, I never thought I would see these people, Roy Clark, on a routine basis. And that was a series that was really started by Colonel Gabriel. He's the one who instituted that into a full swing, dedicated guest artist series. And then you get unusual acts, kind of like the Flintstones and the Star Trek characters. That was much more humorous. Those were usually kiddie shows. I think one of the loudest concerts I've ever heard was Shaka Khan. I'm there playing my bassoon. And she had her audio people tell our audio people to boost the sound up as loud as they can get it. And she did that for a reason, because the crowd, this was a max crowd, and they were louder than, or just as loud as the band. We're talking about an audience that was like just through the roof, hooting and hollering. Apparently a lot of people didn't get to get in, so there was like fights outside the Constitution Hall there. So she was one of those megastars. We had Winona, And that list just goes on and on and on. Some of the major jazz artists, people I never thought I would meet. So one of the other experiences I always enjoyed when I was in the DC band as a librarian is that it gave me the opportunity to go TDY with some of the regional bands. And so I'm thinking at USAFE, I went there and did the, actually went on 2 or 3 TDYs to USAFE. Scott Air Force Base, Langley Air Force Base, Pease, Hanson, and March Air Force Base. I enjoyed March because I had some bassoonists there that I was good friends with, Tom Chaparis. And that's a little bit of an interesting story because Tom and I were in regional bands at the time competing for the same tech sergeant stripe. And so it was all dependent on the test because we were pretty equal in other respects. So I'm there and I look at Tom and I say, Tom, why don't we make a deal? Kind of like my band director. Whoever gets the stripe is going to pay the person who doesn't get the stripe $100. So of course I get the stripe, so I pay Tom $100. There was a clarinet player in the band, it was Raphael Sanders. He called me up and said, I don't know why you did that because Tom would never have given you $100. No matter how, he wouldn't even care if you shook on it. So that was one of the more amusing stories that we had. And of course, the other thing that I really liked about the DC band was all the high level officials that would come in for tours. One of the ones that I remembered most was Secretary of the Air Force, Michael Wynn, came in once and was touring the building, getting briefed by all the shops. Came into the library, and I had a lot of things displayed out, and I was just going to talk real briefly. You had about, he said 2 minutes. So I had it all timed out. I would say this, this, and this. But he started staring. He stopped, and that wasn't supposed to happen. And so he's looking at things, and he's starting to ask me questions. We had like a Samuel Barber manuscript out there, some Glenn Miller stuff, and he just started asking me questions. And you could tell the people who were like in charge of maintaining his schedule were like looking at me like, I'm like trying to finish up, and one of the aides started kind of like nudging me to push me out of the way. And he looks over at me and says, he'll go when I'm ready for him to go. So he kept having me talk for about 3 more minutes. So it was the Air Force leaders on both the enlisted and the the enlisted, you think about the chief of staff, and they are highly into bands, and they know the value that bands bring. And they see that on a routine basis from the DC band routinely. That's the significance of that band, is that they're constantly beyond. That's not to take anything away from the other bands, because they have generals too. But the DC band has a few more. Yeah. And that was just a very pleasurable experience. One of the things that I did when I was there was to always volunteer to play at the Chapel 2 for religious services. And there was a lieutenant general by the name of Chris Miller. He was a flute player, and he would routinely play, and I would be playing, so we would play duets. He loved playing with my wife as far as flute, duets, and stuff. One of the nicest guys, but big band supporter. So having that kind of support is very important, especially when they're talking about cuts. Hopefully they're not talking about cuts now, because I think bands do a great service. And even with all the digital and the videos that they're coming out with, those are amazing. What you're doing is totally amazing. And I think it's really influencing people. And that's what's the most important, is to connect and inspire and impact. And
I was fascinated, surprised, both hearing like a lot of these higher ups in the Air Force have musical backgrounds. So we've been fortunate. The last couple of wing commanders we've had have been trumpet players, and a new wing commander has a background in musical theater. I know General Goldfein, I think, was a roadie / guitarist for a while, and I don't know if you saw it. There was an interview I did with the drummer that Sammy Kestenholtz. He's not in LA now, but he was here at Wright Pat, and General Babbitt was the 4-star here.
Oh, yeah.
He used to be a drummer with the Ventures, and I think you know the whole story. But
yes, he
did a reunion show with the Ventures in DC. You may be part of that, or And so I just thought that was really cool to hear that story, that you took lessons from an A1C drummer. Were you part of that concert?
Yes.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
And that was the nice thing is, if it was Lowell Graham, I was definitely on the concert.
Yeah.
The other commanders pretty much let me decide which ones I wanted to do. And I was highly appreciative of that. Just the amazing experiences that you get in that band. We had featured like 4 or 5 Medal of Honor recipients on one of our broadcasts. And I was the escort for Colonel Bud Day, who was one of the most significant prisoners of war for the Air Force of the Vietnam War. But just to hear his experiences, because he was a talker. And I got his book, I read it, and so I was able to ask him questions about what his experiences. Of course, he was still kind of like that in that age way back then when how you referred to different races. He had very strong feelings. But I gave him a coin, and his wife is funny because his wife's name was Doris, as in Doris Day. But she absolutely loved it. She went ecstatic when I gave him a numbered coin for the Air Force Band, just that you're an official member, because you performed with us. And he was a pretty amazing person. If you have TRICARE, it's because of him. The Congress was going to cut TRICARE, and he guilted them. He didn't win the case, but he did guilt them to where they restored it. So that was one of our big advocates for military throughout DOD.
Maybe some final thoughts. This has been fantastic. Final thoughts being why the most important reason we exist as Air Force bandsmen, and then the biggest advice that and tips that you would give those of us that are early on in our career, or really any point in our career, but things to maybe live by and keep in mind as we go through.
Think about the effects that we had when 9/11, and we went out and we did a patriotic tour with Lowell Graham. People were talking about their service and how proud they were of the military, and especially military bands. And for us to come out there and tell the Air Force story, it was a connection that was pretty amazing. As far as recommendations, or what I would do to encourage people young in their careers, reading and looking at your mentors, the great leaders that the Air Force has. I think there's several books that I highly recommend. Exceeding Expectations by Gerald Looney. Bob Vasquez has a great book, So You Want to Be a Chief, and you prepare yourself by going to seminars, listening to motivational speakers, and especially your high-ranking people. And conversely, the high-ranking people need to listen to the enlisted force, and to always be interested in, because the most important is the people. And for Air Force bands, it's the musicians. Because if you take care of them, they'll take care of the mission.
Absolutely. Well, hey, it's been such a pleasure having you join us today, and thank you for everything you've done, your career, all the service, and the service you still continue to provide, and in addition to things like this, where you're still serving as a mentor to those of us that are in currently. It's invaluable, and thank you.
And thank you for this series and for inviting me to be a part of it. It's quite an honor.